Today's webinar is being hosted by NCSL's Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee and is part of the committee's 2015 Spring Webinar Series. For a complete schedule and registration, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. I am the Program Director for Environmental Health at NCSL, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, which will cover the state's roles in the Food Safety Modernization Act. Before we begin, I would like to mention that the webinar is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar and presentation of the slides on the NCSL website. We will send out a notice shortly with the link to these resources. Today, we are very pleased to have two excellent speakers in the food safety arena. Our first speaker will be Mike Taylor. Michael R. Taylor is the Deputy Commissioner for Foods and Veterinary Medicines, U.S. Department of Food and Drug Administration. We also have Jim Gorney, who's the Vice President for Food Safety and Technology with the Produce Marketing Association. These two speakers will provide a very good overview of the Food Safety Modernization Act, how it will impact the states, and how these changes to the regulatory arena for food safety will impact not only state agencies, but the industry as well, and how this program is seen as a state, federal, industry partnership, all working together to making sure that the nation's food safety system remains intact. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Michael R. Taylor, Deputy Commissioner, Food and Drug Administration. Michael?
Yeah, thank you, Doug, and good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you are. Doug, I just really appreciate this opportunity to connect with the NCSL community and have this discussion of where we are in implementing the Food Safety Modernization Act. I'm glad to be on with Jim Gorney, who, of course, is with the Produce Marketing Association now, but he was a colleague of ours here at FDA and, you know, a real safety leader in his own right, so delighted to be on with Jim. But I think this conversation with the NCSL community is really crucial because, as you indicated, the role of the states is just central to this whole vision of how we modernize our food safety system. And we just, here at FDA, are just very clear that we cannot succeed without really productive collaboration with the states. And we've been doing a lot of work to fulfill that vision, and I'll outline some of that here today. And again, I think legislatures, state legislatures going forward will have roles to play. And I think, so again, that just really welcome this opportunity to share perspectives and really would love to hear any questions, concerns that the folks on the webinar might have. But I think just to review the bidding a little bit on what the Food Safety Modernization Act is, where it came from, you know, why it's in play, probably don't need to go into great detail, but I think folks are aware that over the last decade or more, there have been a number of visible outbreaks of foodborne illness associated with a very wide array of food commodities, spinach, lettuce, an array of leafy green and produce commodities, peanut butter and peanut butter products, cheese products, and really everything in between. There have been a number of outbreaks that have illustrated that while we have a fundamentally sound food safety system and food supply, among the safest in the world, there's room for improvement in how we address foodborne illness. And what we really have common cause about across the whole food system, government and industry, is that everybody has the same objective. And everybody wants to have the safest possible food supply. These outbreaks are not only bad for public health and consumers, they're very disruptive and costly for the food system itself, having lasting negative economic effects on particular commodity sectors when there's a major outbreak. Some people say that the spinach sector, for example, has not even fully recovered yet from the 2006 outbreak of illness in terms of demand for products. So we're all in it together. There's really a sense of common cause that we want the safest possible food supply, and we want to have consumer confidence in the food supply. So what Congress did in enacting FSMA in January of 2010 is say that we've learned a lot over the last decade or more about how to prevent these problems from happening in the first place, about how we can be in a position not just reacting, responding to outbreaks after the fact and suffering the consequences, but actually systematically prevent outbreaks from occurring. And this is learning that really has happened principally in the food industry. I mean, FDA has been part of the process of learning from these experiences, but the food industry has pioneered these modern approaches to what we call preventive controls in food manufacturing, have pioneered new practices in produce production that we know can make food safer if they are widely, consistently, and appropriately implemented. And so Congress basically said, in Food Safety Modernization Act, that's what we're going to do. We're going to see that these modern best practices for preventing contamination, for preventing foodborne illness are implemented across the food system. And what Congress meant by that was comprehensively across the farm-to-table spectrum, first of all, so recognizing that whereas historically we have not had direct regulatory oversight over production practices on farms in the produce sector, we now need to have standards that set out the basis for accountability for prevention at the farm level. We've had experience with modern preventive measures in certain elements of food manufacturing, like meat and poultry and seafood. Congress said we have to do that comprehensively across all commodities, all food manufacturing sectors. Congress mandated that we set standards for safe transport of food. So it's a farm-to-table approach, but it's also a global approach. And Congress recognized that we have to apply these standards not only domestically, but we have to be sure that imported product is meeting the same standards as product produced here in the United States. So a really central element of FSMA is this mandate to create a new import oversight system that, again, shifts the government oversight from basically reactive to preventive. So instead of just relying on FDA at ports of entry to be screening products on a very limited basis in terms of our ability to physically examine less than 2% of imports, we now have Congress saying importers should have systems in place to verify that the food they're importing meets our standards, a so-called foreign supplier verification program, which is a huge strengthening of the system as a whole, because it says importers who are bringing food in here now have a food safety responsibility. We're also, of course, mandated in this new import system to be more present overseas, to do more overseas foreign facility inspections, work with foreign governments to strengthen our oversight of imports. So again, it's farm to table, it's domestic and global. It really is a comprehensive transformation of the system towards prevention. And as I said, it's based upon what industry has learned over the last number of years about what is work, what are the science and risk-based practical preventive things that work to reduce foodborne illness. A strong theme of the law is that we need to respect the diversity of the food system. We need to respect that there are firms of all different sizes, many diverse approaches to production. There can't be one-size-fits-all standards that aren't adaptable across all of this diversity. And so that's a clear message in the law, and it's a very central idea as we work to implement the law. I mean, one of the very positive features of this whole Food Safety Modernization Act implementation is that it really does enjoy incredibly strong stakeholder support. It was a coalition of industry and consumer folks who came together to work with Congress and the administration to get the law passed. That coalition has really stuck together as we've gone through the implementation process. We're just enormously grateful for and obviously benefiting enormously from having that broad, deep, sustained stakeholder support for this work. So the implementation work is organized in two major phases at this point. The phase one, as we call it, is the rulemaking process, is the promulgation of the actually numerous major regulations that Congress mandated that we issue to implement this vision of a science and risk-based prevention system. And there are actually 7 major rules that we are in the process of finalizing that will establish the basic prevention framework. And we're working on working on getting those rules done under a very specific timetable that is being overseen by a court, and so we're on a very, very deliberate pathway that will get us to final regulations starting end of August, where the 2 regulations that address preventive controls in food facilities will be issued. End of October, the final rules related to imports, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, among others, will be issued, and the produce safety rule will be issued end of October, and then into next year there'll be the transportation rule and a rule on intentional adulteration, really thinking in the biocare context, will be issued later in the spring next year. So, these rules are the product of a very, very extensive outreach and dialogue process with our stakeholders, multiple iterations, hundreds literally of meetings, face-to-face meetings, and with large public settings and small one-on-one engagements with industry sectors and consumer groups and so forth. And we even published a re-proposal on a number of the major issues after we had the first round of comment. And so we feel good that we're going to get to final rules at the end of this, later this year and early next year that really will be workable across diversity, and I think they're very responsive to what we've been able to learn from stakeholders during this comment process. So that's phase one. It's been a lot of work. It's taken time, but it really is, frankly, only the first step. It's a big step, but it's really only the first step of what will be an ongoing process of implementation, because the phase two implementation is, so what happens once you have the rules on the books? And our vision is that the way we'll get the food safety benefit, the consumer confidence benefit, is not just by having rules, written down and codified in the Code of Federal Regulations, but we'll actually get high rates of compliance with those rules, and that they will become the basis for a consistent quality preventive efforts across the whole food system. And that's a goal that we all share, the whole community that's been engaged in this. And the question is, how do we achieve that? And this is where, again, there's some very important change going on within FDA and the way in which we think about how we do our job, because we've developed a completely new vision of how to get to compliance, how to get to those high rates of compliance to get the food safety benefit. And it's a vision, it's a strategy that's premised on what's really been made clear to us throughout this whole process, which is that the vast majority of people producing food, commercially, want to produce safe food. I mean, it's pretty obvious. They have a huge business interest in producing safe food. And they want to do whatever is the right thing. They want to comply with whatever the standards are. And so we want to build our compliance activity based upon that, that strength, really, of broad common purpose. And so rather than take our traditional approach to implementing a new regulation, which is very much an inspect and enforce approach, where we go in and inspect and we look for problems and possible violations of legal requirements. And instead, let's take an approach that begins with supporting compliance, recognizing that education and technical assistance and various forms of outreach to the community that wants to comply will be the most efficient way to get very high degree of compliance. And so our strategy, our funding strategy, our working with the states is starting, in this phase one implementation, it's really starting with preparing to provide that sort of technical assistance and guidance and education to support compliance. We always make very clear that a feature of FSMA is that there has to be verification that compliance is happening, and there has to be accountability when it's not happening. And so one thing that FSMA does for us is give us important new inspection and enforcement tools, ways that we can act much more swiftly administratively rather than going to court to address situations where a firm just doesn't get it or is unwilling or for whatever reason is putting consumers at risk. We can act swiftly, and we will, but we know that the most efficient way to get to the food safety goal is to be working with this community that by and large overwhelmingly wants to comply. And so that's really the essence of our vision, our strategy for the post-final rule implementation work. So that's a big picture overview of how we're seeing this. But the thing that I want to zero in on now is the role of the states, because in addition to mandating this approach to prevention, giving us these tools to verify compliance, Congress in the law directed that we continue a process that we've been working on for some time, but continue a process to create a national integrated food safety system, a term that is present in the law. It's an idea that we have embraced for a long time. Congress has now made it a mandate for us to work in full partnership with states to successfully implement this new vision of a comprehensive prevention-oriented approach to food safety. And Congress spelled out areas in which we're to do that, including being sure that we understand where state capacities are and where state capacity needs to be improved. We got new grant mechanisms to support state capacity building. We were directed to work even more closely in the laboratory arena and the inspection arena. A specific mandate was given to us in the produce area to work closely with states. And this mandate really builds, particularly in the area of preventive controls in food facilities, builds on a long history of FDA collaborating with states in carrying out our food safety mandate. In fact, in food facilities, manufacturing and processing facilities, almost half of FDA inspections are actually done now by state agencies under contract with state agencies. So that kind of collaboration is not new. What Congress is saying is take it to another level in terms of more thorough integration, coordination, consistency, make it really a joint program rather than just FDA farming out a certain number of inspections to agencies. And so we really embrace the full partnership model that the Congress has in mind. Produce is different. We certainly have worked with states in the produce arena, mostly though in response to problems, or in response to outbreaks, where we work closely with states in investigating the outbreaks and working to contain outbreaks. We've done some work with the states in some of the voluntary efforts we've made to foster produce safety, working with the states on good agricultural practices for safe production of produce. But we've not had the same degree of operational collaboration with states in the produce area as we have in the food manufacturing setting. FSMA changes that because, again, for the first time, we've got enforceable standards on the farm. We have made a decision, that we have to rely on states to be successful. Let me put it that way. We have to rely on states to be the primary frontline interface in this integrated food safety system, the primary frontline interface with farmers, with growers who are now going to be subject to this new regulatory system. And I think the reasons for that are pretty obvious. States have the advantage of local frontline presence. They know the local community. They know it from a food safety standpoint, from a commercial standpoint. And they've got, in many cases, just really deep, trusting relationships with the grower community that FDA will never be able to duplicate, frankly. And so we've really made a conscious decision to work with the state departments of agriculture, the state health departments, state food safety regulators to develop a program of oversight for produce that does rely fundamentally on states to be the government presence in providing technical assistance and education, but also in providing compliance oversight as we go through the implementation process in coming years. We've been working in this effort particularly closely with the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, which of course is a member organization of your state agricultural secretaries and commissioners. We actually have a cooperative agreement with NASDA through which we're providing some funding to support this joint planning effort on how we successfully implement the new regulations. They're involving in that organizations that work with other state agencies, so the Association of Food and Drug Officials, which represents food and drug regulators, whether they're health departments or agriculture departments, is part of this effort. Likewise, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, which represents the state health officers, is part of this overall effort. And so again, what we really aspire to do is working very, very closely with these state partners, truly integrate our efforts, identify capacity building needs, address those as best we can to strengthen the capacity of the states to do this work, and to build a program that is nationally consistent with respect to basic approaches and sort of levels of consistent quality of inspection, for example, adequate capacity on a relatively consistent basis. Not that there's going to be like a cookie cutter state approach. Each state is institutionally different in how they manage food safety and what their legal frameworks are, and we're not here to say what those should be, but we want to work with, on a state-by-state basis, those in those states who have responsibility for food safety. I want to close by just emphasizing what is the elephant in the room and the obvious huge challenge, which is that all of this great vision, and all this aspiration to work with the states, partner with the states, and really have dependence on the states for the success of this federal food safety initiative. I mean, obviously, depends on funding. We have to get funding to the states to support this work, and we're just very, very clear on that in all of our planning efforts. And funding for the states is a central part of our funding activity, of our budget request, pending on the Hill in Congress right now, the 2016 budget request. The biggest single piece of that request is $32 million for funding for the states. We envision seeking similar funding in future years. We need to build up a base of funding for the states to be, if we're going to be able to successfully partner and rely on the states. Otherwise, it's an unfunded mandate. Nobody wants that. We've got to get this funded, and so that's a major focus of effort. I know the folks at NASDA and elsewhere are focused on that, working within the process to support the funding. We're extremely grateful for that. But this is going to be an area where I think we'll need collaboration in future years to build up the funding base for that. We know that we are working in a resource-constrained environment at the federal level, just as folks are at the state level. There were estimates that the Congressional Budget Office made of how much it would cost in total in terms of increases in FDA's base funding for food safety to successfully implement the Food Safety Modernization Act, and they called for a total base increase over the 5-year period from our 2010 base. 5 years after that, they said we needed to be about $580 million above that 2010 base by 2015. Well, if we get full funding of our 2016 request, we'll still be only halfway, or less than halfway actually, to what the Congressional Budget Office said we needed to implement this law. We know you never get all the money you need. We totally get that reality, but we're being very careful in the requests that we're making, very careful and aggressive actually about redeploying all of our current resources, achieving efficiencies in our current program. But there's just no substitute for additional funding for FDA, but also critically for the states. And again, we've increased state funding over the last several years, significantly approaching around $50 million, but we need to go significantly up from there to be able to make this a success. So we're just really realistic about that. We don't, we're not going to be in the business in implementing this law pretending we can do things that we're not funded to do. We can't be given, all of us, state and federal, in our view, can't be given entirely new jobs to do without the resources to do it. So I'm going to keep beating that drum until the stick falls out of my hands from fatigue, whatever, exhaustion. So again, we're just eager in all aspects of FSMA to work with the state community, and including particularly the legislative community. I think through our conversations with NASDA, we gather that there's some considerations about it. And NASDA, I think, is actually doing a survey of states to see where states may want to do some legislating to ensure that they lodge where they want to lodge and with the right authorities. They set up the states to collaborate with FDA on implementing FSMA. That, again, is sort of state business. We're not here to dictate any of that, but I can imagine that some of the legislatures will be hearing from their agencies about opportunities to adjust state laws to help support the successful implementation of FSMA. Anything we can do, any technical assistance, any questions you have for us that can be helpful in that legislative respect, feel free. Jeff Farah, who is in charge of our strategic relationships and very much focusing on our state relationship, former director of the Food and Drug Program in California, and on the call here is our leader in that realm. And I know Doug and Jeff are in contact consistently. So just let us know how we can be helpful to you in doing this FSMA-related work, and any questions that pop up on any aspect of it, feel free to surface those, and we'll try to be as responsive as we can. So I think that's plenty for me to have said. Doug, again, thanks a lot for doing this, and look forward to Jim's presentation and any questions that folks have.
Commissioner Taylor, thank you very much. We do have actually several questions, but I'm going to limit them just to some very pressing ones that are coming forward. One of them is on capacity building grants for the states, who's eligible to apply?
I think I won't misspeak on this, but in terms of, legislatively, in terms of this new grant program, if that were the vehicle, I don't think there are any restrictions on which element of state government can apply. I think the answer would be, and Doug, I'll be sure my management folks get back to you and confirm the accuracy of this, but it would be, whatever element of the state government is the competent authority, if you will, is the one that has the responsibility. So, we want to work with whomever in the state has the responsibility to do the work that needs to be done to support FSMA implementation. So, so let's, any state that has a question about that, let's be in direct touch and we'll work with you.
Great. One final question before we move on to Dr. Gorney. Several notes have popped up here, questions about the interest of having you or having FDA coming to the states or being available via conference call with the legislators and specifically on committee time when they're talking about this. Are you available, or are you allowed to speak to legislative committees on this issue?
Definitely allowed and available to the extent, schedule permits. Jeff Farah, we have other folks beyond myself who could do this well also, but honestly, our philosophy is anybody who wants to work with us to try to implement this law well, we want to make every effort to be present and engaged and helpful. So don't hesitate to surface those opportunities, and we'll do our absolute best to fulfill them, Doug.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Commissioner Taylor. We're going to move on now to the second part of our presentation today. We're having joined today by Jim Gorney, who's the Vice President of Food Safety and Technology of the Produce Marketing Association. His primary responsibilities are to assist produce industry members with issues associated with food safety, product quality, agricultural innovation, processing and packaging technology, and environmental sustainability. Dr. Gorney has been involved extensively with the food safety system and working with folks at the Food and Drug Administration Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. Without further ado, Dr. Gorney.
Thanks, Doug, for that kind introduction, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to address the NSL community here. So, as Doug mentioned, I do work for the Produce Marketing Association. We are a trade organization. We have about 2,500 members in 45 countries worldwide. We represent everything related to fresh produce, fresh fruits, vegetables, fresh cut flowers, etc. And food safety is an important issue to us because we're all about growing consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables. We believe it's, the superfood, right? I mean, it's the cure for obesity, cancer, many of the things that ail us today. And we want to reduce any impediments to consumers having fears about consuming fresh produce. And as Mike Taylor mentioned, in recent history, there have been a number of very high-profile foodborne illness outbreaks associated with fresh produce, and we certainly acknowledge the, adverse health outcomes. But we really want to address this bigger issue of consumer confidence. And I also have to say that Mike Taylor also mentioned that it's truly economically damaging when there's one farm in one county, in one state. If they produce adulterated product, it makes people sick. It quite frankly tanks the entire market, the entire category. So it rains on the just and the unjust alike, and folks who had absolutely nothing to do with that outbreak absolutely suffer economically. So that's one of our motivators as well. It's not only to reduce morbidity and mortality, but also this issue of consumer confidence and the adverse consequences economically. We have a thing at PMA called Issues Leadership. We've identified two key areas. One is improved foodborne illness outbreak response, which is actually very reactive, but it is a rich source of information as to what went wrong in a particular foodborne illness outbreak or a recall situation. That's usually not one thing. And Mike Taylor already talked a lot about the Food Safety Modernization Act implementation, and that's really where we want to go with regard to prevention, but I will address both of these issues today. Go to the next slide, please. So when it comes to foodborne illness outbreak investigations, accuracy and speed are absolutely essential. I mean, there's, as I mentioned, it's an absolute panic in the marketplace. When people hear that someone got sick from eating a specific commodity, people just stop buying that commodity. It's essential that the regulatory agencies get it right with regard to identifying what the potential food vehicle is, and they do it as quickly as possible. And they also, it's critical to get it right because there's no greater injustice than being falsely accused or falsely named with regard to a foodborne illness outbreak. The investigations, though, in this case, are multi-jurisdictional and multi-agency responses. It requires states, locals, tribal governments, et cetera, and both not only FDA but CDC to really help identify what the most likely food vehicle is, and it requires really a coordinated response, and that's really done by both FDA and CDC at the federal level. It also requires timely sharing of information, and that means IT systems, it means picking up the telephone, et cetera. So it's really critical that they have those type of resources available to them when this type of foodborne illness outbreak occurs. Have the next slide, please. As I mentioned, actually states are really the first responders. They're the folks who are the boots on the ground when a foodborne illness outbreak investigation begins. FDA and CDC kind of play a quarterbacking role, but it's really the state folks and the local folks who are out there doing the epidemiology, which is asking the sick individuals what they may have eaten, what their food partners may have eaten also, and they may not have eaten. So the patient interviews are you can imagine, very time consuming. It's a questionnaire of up to 300 different foods, and they literally have to go out and talk to each of these individual ill persons. There's also sampling. So when a foodborne illness outbreak occurs, typically states, locals will actually go out to the marketplace, pick up samples of foods that they suspect may be the cause, and then there's sampling, and I'll talk a little bit about lab capacity later. And then the third leg of any foodborne illness outbreak investigation is the traceback. There's a traceback to a common food source, particularly when it's a multi-state. Again, it requires coordination to see if it traces back to any one particular food producer or distributor. And quite frankly, this is a fairly common occurrence. I mean, the CDC tracks about 800 foodborne illness outbreaks a year, 50 to 40 clusters every week. They're kind of making sure that none of them get out of control, and they're trying to choose the ones they'll probably have the biggest health impact. You also have to understand that the folks in your states are under tremendous media scrutiny with regard to demands to identify that likely food source. So it's probably not every day that they get the New York Times or the major newspaper in your state calling up the public health officials saying, what is the food? And they also have a statutory obligation to protect the public health of those citizens in their state. So they want to get it right, and they want to get it and do it as quickly as possible. But again, it can be difficult if they don't have the right resources available to them. And again, oftentimes information sharing can be constrained either by IT systems or not being credentialed, not having the proper agreements in place between states and feds. So that's a concern of ours, and certainly things that can be addressed. We also have to understand that states often potentially have limited perspective on an outbreak. So it may look like a particular food in one particular state because it went through one particular distributor, but it really needs to be put together from a very high level at both the CDC and the federal level, especially when you're dealing with a multi-state foodborne illness outbreak, to make sure, again, that all the data matches, whether it's in one state or another, all the data matches up as best as can be expected with regard to what the most likely food vehicle is. So again, coordination from FDA and CDC is critical, and again, the states play a really critical role with regard to collecting the on-the-ground information. If I can have the next slide, please. So with regard to this idea of a national integrated food safety system, certainly one of the solutions is, and Mike Taylor quite frankly hit it right on the head, it relates a lot to increased funding for public health agencies, whether that's at the state or at the federal level. And we've certainly joint training, as I mentioned, communications is key, and really involving Fed, state, industry. And we've seen a very good model actually develop out in California. It's called the California Food Emergency Response Team. That's state and federal agencies working very well together. There's been a number of foodborne illness outbreaks, again, associated with products that have come out of California. This team was assembled. They've done a great job. It's totally integrated. They talk to each other. They know their policies, their procedures and practices, and their boots on the ground, good to go. And they've actually even involved industry folks to talk about distribution patterns, to talk about to help get the word out with regard to what went wrong on some of these foodborne illness outbreak investigations, to report out. Again, these are very rich sources of information to tell people what went wrong in a particular incident. The other issue relates to lab capacity. We certainly need increased funding for lab capacity. We've got things on the horizon now, things like what are called whole genome sequencing, which really helps the states and the feds and the investigators pull together and identify that illnesses are, one, related, and then potentially looking at environmental samples or food samples that they can clearly get the link between the ill individuals and the potential food vehicle. So this is really critical that they have appropriate levels of lab capacity, and again, that they're working in an integrated manner with the feds and the states. I can't say enough about this. I mentioned it twice already. It's with regard to post-response. There needs to be monies available for the state departments of public health and the Fed to really go out and talk about education outreach to industry, to understand what went wrong when one of these disasters happened. When a plane crash occurs, NTSB and FAA go out, they investigate the disaster, and every pilot of that particular type of plane gets that information as to what went wrong so that they can be aware of it. We need to have that same type of response going on with regard to foodborne illness outbreaks. Again, greater coordination and information sharing, absolutely critical between the states. And again, we've seen some progress in this area with regard to engaging industry subject matter experts to help in understanding the supply, and I scratched through chains there, and they really are webs. It's very simplistic to think about a food chain going from farm to distributor to grocery store. But in the real world, that's really not how it happens, and certainly engaging industry is part of the solution here with regard to foodborne illness outbreak investigations, I think is really going to be key going forward. And again, capacity building is really what it's all about. Can I have the next slide, please? So moving on to the more preventive approaches here, and what Mr. Taylor talked about with regard to the Food Safety Modernization Act implementation, FDA, and it's kind of wrong there. It's actually Congress has mandated that an integrated approach be taken by FDA for the Food Safety Modernization Act implementation. And I have to applaud the states and the feds and the work that I've seen them doing to really try and come together, work through things, and get down to the business of FSMA implementation in a cohesive manner. We at PMA, again, we acknowledge that there's a lot of local knowledge and a lot of expertise, and that's essential to understanding the laws and implementing the Food Safety Modernization Act. We've seen a lot of state-led models. In California and Arizona, there are marketing agreements which put forward rules. They are overseen by the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement in California and Arizona. And as their oversight is by state government, the verification exercises to make sure that people are doing the right things with regard to the standards. It's already happening. In Florida, actually legislation has already been passed a number of years ago with regard to tomatoes and good agricultural practices. And those are actually paid for by the industry through assessments, both in Florida, California, and Arizona. We see those as workable models that certainly could be taken up in other places. If so desired by industry, and also it's a mechanism to pay for things. We also have a strong feeling that it's much easier, particularly with regard to the produce rule. The produce rule is really the first implementing regulation that we've seen on the farm. Up until now, certainly farms have been regulated by FDA under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, but this really puts down what's in compliance and what's out of compliance when you're producing fruits and vegetables on a farm. And it's a really different environment than a food processing plant or a food, baby food manufacturing or a medical device manufacturing facility. And we strongly believe in the agricultural community that it's much easier to teach an Aggie food safety than it is to teach a food safety professional everything there is to know about agricultural production, handling, and culture. So we were very big proponents of having the states involved with regard to FSMA, with regard to technical assistance, with regard to education outreach, with regard to FSMA readiness reviews, where you're providing fact sheets, you're providing pre-assessments or audits, or some type of assessment of how ready people are for the day comes when the Food Safety Modernization Act will be a requirement on the farms, which is a very short period of time. We also think that locals, that meaning state and county folks, they understand the growing conditions, they understand the constraints, they understand the procedures, policies, and practices best within their states. I think it would just be impossible to truly believe that someone in Washington, D.C. would know exactly how things are done in a farm in the Pacific Northwest and other places. I mean, I think it's a good marriage of both by using both the states and federal approach. Can I have the next slide, please? So the other thing that I think people need to be aware of is the disproportional effects of some of these rules that they'll have on their particular states. This is actually an excerpt from the Food and Drug Administration's environmental impact statement, or draft environmental impact statement of 2015, with regard to the fresh produce rule. Each of those black dots that you see there represent about 1,000 acres of covered produce meaning that which would be covered by the produce rule under FSMA. You can see that states like California, I'm a Californian, we grow about 50% of all fruits and vegetables consumed in the United States. And you've got the Northwest, you've got Florida, you've got Western Michigan, you've got Western New York, you've got specific hotspots where lots of produce is grown. So I think people just need to be aware that these rules will disproportionately affect certain states rather than others. And I think this goes for the other rules as well. Food manufacturing, imports, the foreign supplier verification programs, et cetera, are going to disproportionately affect different states to different degrees. So it's just something to be aware of. Can I have the next slide, please? One of the roles that certainly departments of agriculture already play, state departments of agriculture already play, are market access audits. We would anticipate that the departments of agriculture and states will also play an important role with regard to compliance inspections in the future. They're certainly going to have some challenges with regard to spanning the role of educator, doing market access audits, and being a regulator potentially. And certainly USDA AMS, I think, is going to play an important role here for our state departments of agriculture, and that they're already working with FDA to harmonize audit criteria and the new FSMA produce safety rule requirements. And I think that one of the issues that crops up a lot in the produce arena is this idea of audit fatigue. So many of our producers, and whether they're on a farm or in a packing house or a food manufacturing facility, they're really suffering from multiple audits, whether they be from market access requirements and now they're really concerned about, more audits and more inspections being placed on them. So we really asked FDA, the states that we've been working with, to really try and harmonize these market access audits with the Food Safety Modernization Act, and really try and minimize, redundancy in the system. One of the other issues that certainly comes forward is how are we going to harmonize over all these states the inspection and auditor competency and proficiency. As I mentioned earlier, the California Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement and USDA AMS, which oversees that program for the state of California, provides a lot of that harmonization of inspector competency and proficiency already. They have a good system, they have a good standard, but they also have a good system to assure the competency and proficiency of inspectors, and that's potentially a very good model to look for moving forward. If I could have the next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, agricultural practices and things can be different in various states, and one of the things, again, really focusing on this theme of harmonization for compliance criteria, the Food Safety Modernization Act really takes on food safety as I would call the 50,000-foot level. It says, in many ways, make food safe. The FSMA regulations, which Mike Taylor talked about earlier, there's 7 major ones right now and moving towards being final. Those are really written at the 10,000-foot level. Oftentimes they are not particularly or overly prescriptive, and it still leaves some areas for interpretation. So one of the key aspects is the need for compliance guides from FDA, which they typically do provide, and they've been mandated in the Food Safety Modernization Act to provide a number of these. And they're important for education outreach. They're important for training, so that when people ask a situation-specific question, that particular question can be addressed. And also is to harmonize compliance and verification across all these agencies. So we do hope that the states will play an important role, but it'll also have to be harmonized across all the districts within the FDA and within all the inspectors within the FDA, which is a huge cadre of persons. Show the next slide, please. So certainly one of the things we've been concerned about is, how are we going to do this? How are we going to accomplish this harmonized compliance criteria and compliance policy guide development? And we really think that one of the issues is that inspectors will encounter numerous preventive controls, and they'll have to make a judgment call as to what's in compliance and what's out of compliance. I think it's really important to have a consultative, deliberative, harmonizing process up front so that everybody's on the same page when it comes down to what they see in their facility or in their state, and then that they can run it through a process to get adjudication as to if it's truly in bounds or out of bounds, in compliance or out of compliance. Kind of the next slide, please. And actually, this type of process already exists. So for those of you who aren't familiar, there is what's called the U.S. Model Food Code, and that's developed by FDA. It's updated every couple of years, and that's to really harmonize across all the local and the retail establishments in the United States with regard to food safety practices. It tries to harmonize across all 3,500 of those jurisdictions from states and counties so that everybody's looking at the same thing in retail organizations. They meet every couple of years. They look at specific issues. Again, they provide guidance to FDA. At the end of the day, FDA still has the final editorial decision, but it provides a process for people to vet things through as to what's in compliance or out of compliance, which may actually be very unique in their states with regard to the practices or procedures that people are using. The other thing that Mike Taylor also talked about, which I want to point out at this point, is that local and states, they do the bulk, actually, of the food safety inspections in this country already with regard to retail inspections, distribution centers, restaurants, and they're also contracted under FDA. So this isn't a new concept, but we think that it's the way to go. There's also been discussion in the President's fiscal 16 federal budget of a single food safety agency. We think that's just too far, too fast, too soon, especially with the Food Safety Modernization Act. But we fully support this idea of a national integrated food safety system where the states are co-equal partners with FDA, both on the preventive approach using FSMA and the foodborne illness outbreak response. So with that, I'll go to the next slide, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to entertain those.
Dr. Gorney, thank you very much. Your presentation did build up several questions. I'm going to try my best to get to as many of them as possible. The first one goes a little bit to you, but maybe even more so to Mike Taylor, is to what extent can states adopt policies that are independent of the Food Safety Modernization Act? Would they be able to adopt a policy that might be a little bit different than the produce safety rule, or does it? Are we going to have one single standard for the entire country?
Yeah, I'll let Mike answer that one.
No, the central, one of the central ideas of FSMA was to create a nationally uniform set of standards, and so states wouldn't be able to adopt different standards that conflict with the federal standards. Typically, in federalism and sort of preemption policy, states have some leeway to set more restrictive standards. But how that would work out in a FSMA context would be very situational, very specific to a particular situation. But I think that where we have, certainly among our stakeholders we work with in industry and the consumer community, there's a lot of support for the idea of having consistent national standard that people can count on and that can provide clarity and certainty for both industry and consumers.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Dr. Gorney.
Yeah, this is Jim. Also, within the produce rule, there are variances that are allowed by states. So if there's specific variants that can be requested by the state, there is a mechanism for states to do that under the produce rule, and that they've got the scientific data to basically show that it provides an equal level of public health protection. The states can actually petition FDA and get a variance for a particular practice within the produce rule.
Yeah, Jim, thanks so much for broaching that. I mean, that's absolutely part of the law, and I think any state that has unique circumstances where they think there are different ways to get to the same food safety outcome, taking a different approach in terms of standards, please come talk to us, and we'll work. We want to work with states in those areas where they think there are those opportunities.
A question came up about imports. What is the growth rate for imports on produce rule, or I'm sorry, on produce or on other products that are going to be falling under the under FSMA?
I can just off the top of my head give you some of the common factoids, but we're at now up to 12 to 13 million distinct import entries for food generally. I can't break it out by produce entries, and that's basically quadrupled over the last 10 or 12 years. It's just an amazing increase in volume of imports. Produce, Jim may have more specific numbers, but we typically we typically say that we import about 50% of our fresh fruit and 20% of our fresh vegetables here in this country, and there are huge volume of imports, particularly from Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America in the produce sector.
Yeah, so certainly one of the other major rules is the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, which really puts the onus on the importer to make sure that whoever they're importing from, if it's a raw agricultural commodity or produce item, that the persons they're buying from on the farm are following the produce rule, or if it's a manufactured food, that they're following the preventive controls rule. Up until now, FDA's had fairly weak preventive controls in that things would show up at the border and they'd have to figure out whether it's safe or not. I mean, certainly they look at food history and they take samples, but this really places a preventive approach on the persons in commerce, and whoever owns that product when it crosses the border has now a responsibility to make sure that it's as safe as if it was produced in the United States.
This seems like this rule seems to be very reliant on continued support from Congress. What can legislators do to ensure that Congress will continue this funding?
Well, I just think it's a matter of Congress understanding how important this is to the food system. We talk with members and staff a lot about this, and what's very positive is that everybody gets that food safety is important, and everybody gets that FSMA needs to be implemented appropriately. They have in today's budget climate choices to make with finite resources. So like any other situation, they just need to hear from citizens and people who have a stake in the success of the food system, which is just about everybody. They need to just hear why this is important. This is beyond. FDA asks for the money in the budget through the president's budget, but this isn't about FDA. It's about the food system, and the more folks are hearing from the many participants in the system who have a stake, I think that's how Congress can make an informed decision and make those choices, to support food safety.
This is a question for Dr. Gorney. There is some queries here about how much do these food safety outbreaks cost the industry. Basically, they're trying to get a sense here of what's the cost-benefit analysis of implementing FSMA versus the cost that we incur from these foodborne outbreaks.
That's a very good question. So there's tangibles and there's intangibles. I mean, certainly FDA has prepared a regulatory impact analysis, which goes line item by line item, provision by provision, what it'll cost for the industry to implement these provisions, and how much morbidity and mortality will be reduced by each of those provisions. But the point that I was trying to make in my presentation is that there are intangibles, and that's marketplace confidence in the food supply. It's also liability. So my members are, putting aside the morbidity and mortality, which they are concerned about. It's really the marketplace disruptions, and it's the liability that they're out there on the line for with regard to these foodborne illness outbreaks. And they really are demanding a level playing field from everybody, whether it's domestically produced or imported, because we can't continue going on like we are. And that's really critical to move the ball forward on food safety, because we want people to eat lots more fruits and vegetables.
Yeah, so those impacts are very significant, and you've seen different estimates of like just one of the most glaring examples of how disruptive and costly an outbreak can be, an incident can be, is there was the Peanut Corporation of America outbreak. Caused several deaths and many illnesses, but also had product going into literally thousands of processed foods as an ingredient in thousands of processed foods, all of which had to be recalled. So I've seen estimates in excess of $1 billion as the aggregate cost of that. So it's enormous. But with respect to the reductions in illness and deaths and the direct costs associated directly from that, medical costs, lost productivity, we estimate about $77 billion, is the annual cost of just the foodborne illness cost, and that doesn't get to the disruption of the food system costs that Jim was talking about.
So this is a very critical issue for the states, and these programs that Jim mentioned about the CalFIRT and products with both Arizona and activities in Arizona and Florida really makes a big difference for the industry.
Yeah, and that again, I just would echo what Jim said. I mean, these initiatives where we're really fully integrating the FDA and the state first responders around outbreaks has just been a huge success, and that idea, which was pioneered in California, is now spread to I don't know, 15 or 20 states, and is a growing program. And again, just a great model of how operationally, if we're working hand in glove with the states, we can all do such a better job in meeting public expectations.
I have a question here as a trade wonk that I have to ask. Any sense that the foreign supplier verification rule may be challenged as a trade barrier?
This is an issue, of course, we are responsible for being thoughtful about. We are all, of course, subject to the disciplines of the World Trade Organization agreements, and Congress even took pains in FSMA itself to remind us that, of course, any rules we adopt should be consistent with those obligations. And the short answer is yes, we are doing this in a way that is fully consistent with those obligations. We've tried to have as much alignment and efficiency in how we do the foreign supplier verification program, alignment and efficiency in relation to the supplier verification obligations that domestic firms have as they're sourcing ingredients and producing their products here. But there is, in some circumstances, a need for oversight of farm producers that is different. And the International Standard Setting Body for Food, the Codex Commission of the United Nations, which is recognized in the trade agreements as the authoritative body for acceptable standards that don't run afoul of the trade laws, explicitly, or trade agreements, explicitly recognizes that there can be some special provisions for oversight of imports compared to domestic. And it's based upon the understanding that, and I'll use produce as an example since Jim's on, but the understanding that we will have an oversight program partnering with the states for domestic producers and processors, and so they will be subject to public oversight and efforts to ensure and verify compliance with standards. We don't have that direct oversight of farm growers, and so that's why it's acceptable just under the trade agreements to have a foreign supplier verification program that provides an alternative to government presence and direct legal jurisdiction over these foreign growers, which we do not have. So no, I think we're in great shape on that, and we've looked at this carefully. We working that through, and we feel we don't feel a concern there. And again, it's because we're taking care to do it the right way.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We have time for about one more question. I'm just going to do kind of a mishmash of several questions that came across here, but essentially, to what extent will FDA be able to approve or dictate or say how a state shall adopt FSMA requirements, how states shall adopt the food safety system? Is FDA going to be certifying the states, or will FDA simply have a cooperative relationship with state agencies implementing these programs?
Well, look, we don't have the authority to dictate anything to the states about how they want to work on food safety under FSMA. So it will be collaborative. It has to be collaborative. So yeah, that's just like a really simple answer to that question. this is yeah. I mean, I think what FSMA does, by virtue of particularly and very specifically in the produce section, saying we are to work with the state authorities that have oversight of produce safety. We're directed to coordinate with them. I mean, it creates expectations, but it doesn't give us the authority to mandate that the states do anything. So it's got to be done in a collaborative way. And again, we feel a responsibility to seek and hopefully obtain federal funding to support the state work.
With that, I want to put out a thank you to both our speakers, Dr. Jim Gorney and Michael Taylor. We would like to also put in a thank you out to our attendees for participating in today's webinar. As a reminder, a recording of today's webinar and the presentation slides will be made available at the NCSL website. You will receive an email shortly about how to access these resources and register for upcoming webinars in the Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee next webinar series. But with that, I want to say again, thank you for all who attended. Thank you to our two speakers today. And for everyone, please have a pleasant afternoon. On behalf of NCSL, this is Doug Farquhar. Have a good afternoon.